If you clicked on this video, you're probably wondering which cloud provider is better, AWS or Azure. Picking the wrong one could lead to compliance issues, longer time to deploy, or higher costs. I've worked at 3 different levels of this so far. So the first company I worked at was a small consulting firm where everything was about speed and how quickly can we get something deployed. The second company was a large consulting firm that ended up migrating from on-premise into Azure. And now I work for a large government entity where we manage thousands of servers across AWS, GCP, Azure, and on-premise with VMware. In this video, I'm going to do a side-by-side comparison of AWS to Azure. We'll talk about which one's best for a startup versus an enterprise, or where you might fall in between that. By the end of this video, you should have a clear answer on which one's best for your needs. Okay, so a quick intro if you're not familiar. Azure is the Microsoft managed cloud service, whereas AWS is Amazon Web Services. These are the top 2 cloud providers. AWS currently has the lead as they started earlier and they grew very quickly, but Azure's been catching up very rapidly due to their enterprise support. So AWS currently has 31% of the entire market share as of 2024, and they're still the largest. Azure's currently at 25%, but like I said, that's growing very quickly due to their enterprise support. They tend to support some larger clients. And generally, AWS will lead in startups. They have a really good startup program. Their startup program actually offers $100,000 in credits for your first year if you're an eligible startup. So check that out if you're looking to start your own company. So now moving into the service offerings, AWS offers about 200 different cloud services, and it has unmatched flexibility and scalability. If you're looking to do something like machine learning or data analytics with that global infrastructure that AWS offers, that's really the more mature ecosystem here. Azure, on the other hand, is usually the best choice for businesses that rely on Microsoft tools like Windows, Active Directory, Office 365. Azure makes it a really seamless integration with those services and an easy transition between the cloud and the on-premise infrastructure you might have. As you guys are probably familiar, Azure has a strong partnership with OpenAI after Microsoft has invested in them. So if you're looking to use OpenAI services or maybe building out your own RAG application, Azure might be the best choice there. Now let's get into pricing. This one, there's not going to be a ton of variability. There will be some differences in what they charge for each, but generally cloud pricing is cloud pricing. So AWS follows that pay-as-you-go model with the deep optimization tools. And generally, I lean towards AWS when I'm looking for that kind of cost optimization. They have some really good billing dashboards that allow you to really get fine-grained access. Azure has similar, but I haven't found it as good as the AWS services. Azure, however, does offer huge discounts for enterprises that are already using Microsoft software. So again, if that's your business, if you're just looking to get into which cloud you should be using and you're running mostly a Microsoft shop, it's probably a good pick for that reason. With that being said, you could always just run your Active Directory through Azure and whatever O365 applications you have, and then use AWS for all the other cloud services. Really, though, for pricing, there's not a clear winner. There's a little bit of variability in what they charge for each, but generally it's a pay-as-you-go model, and you'll have to look specifically into what services you might be using more so if you know that you're going to be focused on something. Like if you run a data analytics business, there might be one option that's better than the other. Okay, so enterprise adoption, this is where we get our first real clear winner. If you look across the US, 90% of Fortune 500 companies use Azure. And that's just because of that Microsoft integration. So many of these companies are stuck in that sticky Microsoft business that Azure is just another part of that ecosystem that they end up getting pulled into. I wanted to jump in quickly while I'm editing here. That part sounded a little negative where I said that their business model is sticky. And yes, it is, but that's for good reason. They do that on purpose. They want you to get into the ecosystem and build your business around it, which is what most companies do. And it's how Microsoft has become the multi-trillion-dollar company it is. On the other hand, though, AWS is dominant among tech startups. It is really all of those cloud-first companies, the newer innovative companies, tend to lean towards AWS if they want a lean infrastructure and don't have anything that's already holding them into Microsoft. Okay, next up, let's move into the developer experience. So for developers, AWS has a vast ecosystem of SDKs and APIs as well as third-party integrations, and it's really the best choice for cloud-native applications. That's partially my opinion, also partially fact. However, Azure's a little bit more developer-friendly. In my opinion and my experience, what I've felt with these 2 cloud providers, when you work with Azure, they really try to make things as abstracted from you as possible, where it's very quick for you to get something up and started and go. AWS has that in some sense too. But there's pros and cons to that, where it makes things easier for you, but you don't have as much control. So like I've had some problems working with infrastructure as code tooling or trying to get things exactly how I want them. Sometimes Azure will think they're doing you a favor by handing off stuff. Like they have managed resources for some stuff, like Azure Machine Learning Workspaces. And it's nice because like you just create a machine learning workspace and it builds all these resources for you that you don't even really see. But it can be a real pain because they're still there and you have to manage them. And especially in an environment where you might be handling sensitive data, which like we were, it made it really difficult because we had to set up encryption keys on these services that I didn't even know existed until I started deep diving into Azure ML. That being said, though, because of that option where Azure abstracts away, the learning curve is a little easier. Whereas AWS, it has a stronger learning curve, but it also allows you to have more flexibility in what you're building. All right, moving into security and compliance. Obviously, this is a big thing for both of them. They have to take it very seriously to have any kind of real clients on there. AWS provides an advanced ecosystem and they have tools like IAM, GuardDuty, and Shield. However, Azure is the winner here, in my opinion. They're built for those enterprises, like I mentioned before, and because of that, they really put an emphasis on their security and compliance, and they make it really easy for small teams to manage this stuff. When I first started working with Azure, I didn't like it over AWS, and I wasn't really sure why so many companies used it. But Azure Policy is a huge win for what they've built. Azure Policy, if you're not familiar, so with Azure Policy, I can set up for my subscription whatever I need to follow. So I might tell it that I need to be up to FedRAMP standards, and then it can actually look at what resources I have across that subscription and tell me what's not up to that standard. So it might say you have a storage account that is public, or your database has access to the internet, which it should not. And anything like that that needs to be met within those standards, it's just a checklist that you run down and you can just check each box. And if you know that you have them checked, you meet those compliance requirements. So it's really good for setting up that kind of environment. I know also AWS has AWS config. I think it does similar. I haven't actually used it. I'm looking into that this week, funny enough. But from what I've understood so far, it doesn't seem like it's up to the same standard as Azure, although it is good. And then lastly, the encryption identity management. This is something that it's really a requirement for any kind of IT environment. So they both offer this. They're very similar. There's some nuance, but they're both very good and easy to use. Okay, getting into that hybrid multi-cloud. This is where a decision has to be made for your business of which you're going to do. If you want to fully move to the cloud, AWS is probably the better option. But if you need to keep some on-premise infrastructure available, then Azure is really good at this. Azure's the leader here. They have Azure Arc and some other hybrid solutions that you can basically do a site-to-site connection, or there's a few other gateway options for how you make that connection from your on-premise site into your cloud site with Azure. When you work with these tools, it really just feels like it's one network and it's not hard to set up this type of hybrid environment. AWS, however, they want you to do that full cloud migration. So it's really about how can we change this infrastructure to be cloud native and be fully on AWS. But that being said, they do offer outposts for hybrid needs, so you can still have this support. Next up, let's move into performance and reliability. Obviously, these are keys for any type of company, but I think as you scale up in revenue and more towards that enterprise type of company, it becomes more of an emphasis. AWS here is the winner. They have the most extensive global network of data centers, and they ensure that low latency and higher resilience. Azure, however, has a strong data center network optimized for Microsoft workloads and hybrid deployments. Both platforms have strong SLAs, but AWS generally leads in that raw network performance and latency. And if you need maximum global outreach, AWS is slightly ahead here. Okay, final verdict here. Which cloud should you use? If you're a startup, a developer, or a company looking for cloud native applications, AWS is the best choice. It offers unmatched scalability and flexibility. Then if you're an enterprise, that one particularly that already uses the Microsoft suite, Azure is going to be the best option. It's got a seamless integration with the Microsoft services and strong hybrid capabilities. And it makes it the top pick for businesses that need to bridge that gap between their on-premise and cloud environments. But ultimately, the right choice really depends on your pricing needs, your security requirements, workload type, and existing technology stack. Both AWS and Azure are industry leaders. You can't really go wrong picking either one. But in my opinion, the worst thing you could do is spread yourself too thin across multiple platforms. So try and use AWS for your data workloads and Azure for your enterprise workloads, and then on-premise for some of your database infrastructure. Like when companies start doing that, they can't scale on that learning curve. They end up growing to a low level on the learning curve and learning the basics, but they never become an expert in any of them and they can't optimize them. And you don't even really get the benefits at that point of using each cloud unless you're already a massive company, which in that case, you're probably running your own workloads on prem anyway. But with that being said, if you need more help trying to figure out whether you should be on prem or in the cloud, check out this video here.